The next topic is digital trade, future of supplies enabled by additive manufacturing, moderated by Dr. Ho Chaw Singh. Here, sort of what I can envision is that the predictive maintenance AI that we talked about on a vessel would predict that a certain spare part needs to be replaced. It would send an order to some 3D manufacturing center on shore somewhere, which produces the part, and then would use the autonomous drone to fly that maybe when the vessel comes sort of 50 kilometers to shore, and then it would be installed by robots and the whole thing would be done. But I think we'll find out what is realistic in the following panel. Dr. Ho Chaw Singh is the CEO of the National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Cluster, or in short NAMIC, which orchestrates public-private partnerships to translate the research into development and deployment of industry-relevant AM technologies and solutions across multiple industry sectors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ho Chaw Singh. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all those tuning in. And my name is Chaw Singh, and I head the NAMIC in Singapore. This is the last session of day 2 of the MarineTech conference on smart shipping. Thank you all for tuning in. I'd like to thank the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore for inviting me to moderate this session. And with me today, we have 3 global experts in trade policies, supply chain, and advanced manufacturing. Without further ado, let me now welcome our speakers and introduce them. First off, we have Puay Guan. Puay Guan is the associate professor at the NUS Business School, where he teaches supply chain management and technology innovation. He's also the academic director of the multidisciplinary Masters of Science in Industry 4.0. He's board advisor for Lockhart AG, a SaaS provider of supply chain planning solutions, and Q Micro, a corporate innovation spinoff. He also serves on the Manufacturing Standards Committee of Enterprise Singapore and is a mentor at the corporate innovation platform Plug and Play APAC. Welcome, Puay Guan. Next up, we have Dr. Javier Lopez Gonzalez. He's a senior economist at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. His recent work focuses on issues related to trade in the digital era. He develops frameworks for the analysis of digital trade, including in the context of exploring what market openness means in the 21st century. His focus is also on the regulatory approaches to cross-border data flows and identifying potential economic costs and benefits of digital trade. He has previously worked on the drivers and implications of participation in global value chains. Javier holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex. Welcome, Javier. The last speaker today is Hakon Elekjaer. He's a shipping and ex-management consultant professional, currently at Wilhelmsen Ship Services. He's passionate about innovation and transformation, developing and bring innovative products, solutions, and services to the maritime industry. As head of additive manufacturing at Wilhelmsen Ship Services, he's charting and enabling the transition to a digital supply chain for maritime and offshore spare parts, producing parts on demand close to the point of need. Welcome, Hakon. So let me just start off by setting some context before I turn the attention to our 3 distinguished speakers today. I know for a lot of you here, beyond the daily reports on the war in Ukraine and the global pandemic situation, it's clear that the supply chain is in chaos. The last time I checked this morning, it's not getting better. Major ports world over, which used to operate like clockwork, are now beset by delays, with container ships queuing for days and some of the worst congestion ever recorded. With COVID outbreak in Shanghai, air freight warehouses at Shanghai Pudong Airport are now locked jam as a result of strict COVID testing protocols imposed on China's bigger city. In Shenzhen, which is a major manufacturing and engineering hub in the country, trucking costs have shot up 300% due to a backlog of orders and a shortage of drivers following the introduction of similar COVID restrictions, and the list goes on and on. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that we're living in a global village with very complex interdependencies among nations. As the world tries to return to pre-COVID levels in industrial and urban activities, we continue to face planetary scale challenges. Climate change has now evolved into climate urgency. Sustainability and development and manufacturing is very important for a future where humanity can live. Already, we are experiencing more extreme weather conditions than before. It is clear we need a paradigm shift in the way we source, produce, and consume. Additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing, is a technology that promises to enable that. Used as a rapid prototyping technology since its invention in the 1980s, industrial adoption of this technology has grown rapidly in the last decade. The ability to harness recycled materials as a feedstock for AM process produced with significantly less material has become paramount. On-demand manufacturing and other benefits such as lightweighting has the potential to transform our future for the better, resulting in more efficient supply chains, lowering carbon footprints, and integrating recycled materials into the manufacturing supply chain. In addition, inherently given the digital nature of additive manufacturing, it can do to physical goods what cloud computing is now doing to digital services by eliminating the intermediary steps in traditional manufacturing, such as in injection molding or casting, thus lowering the cost and improving the speed of innovation. So given this context, we can imagine a world where products and goods can be manufactured on demand with a click of a button. Products in the form of digital designs are stored securely and digitally in the cloud, accessible via marketplaces and online platforms, manufactured on demand with no physical inventories. Now, with this in context, I would like to now turn this to our distinguished speakers, and I'll start off with Puay Guan. First off, Puay Guan, can you help our audience here understand some of the current supply chain models? For example, the spoke and hub model versus distributed. And also, if you can add some insights into how do you see the current situation playing out as it stands?
Okay, thanks, Chaw. Good to be here today. So if you think about the traditional manufacturing process, right, it's very much based on mass manufacturing and economies of scale. So the more we make, basically we bring down the unit cost, and that has been the paradigm of manufacturing, and that's why we look at it from a hub and spoke, like what you mentioned, where we produce in volume, and then with that volume we ship everywhere across the world. Of course, some of those assumptions are changing, partly because of all the disruptions that we all know of, and which you mentioned earlier, and therefore there's more attempts to diversify the supply chain and look at alternative sourcing as well as nearshoring of manufacturing. So some of these trends are playing out. In terms of 3D printing, where it fits in, within the manufacturing line, there are, a whole continuum of different activities, right? So there's a design, there's prototyping, there's the manufacturing, and then there's assembly and final distribution, of the finished products. So within this continuum, there are various, things that can happen. So 3D printing, basically is based on a kind of mainly fixed costs, right? Of course, there are some economies of scale, but most of the manufacturing cost is fixed per product. So unlike the traditional manufacturing, which has declining, cost-based structures on reduction of cost, whereas you manufacture more, 3D printing is more of a fixed cost kind of technology. So the result of that is that is generally more applicable to smaller production volumes. So in cases where, for example, if we think about design and prototyping, this is where it has huge advantages compared to the traditional manufacturing techniques where we have to make a mold but just use it for one or two products. So actually, this allows us to do design and prototyping much more effectively. And then, of course, when we think about applying to manufacturing, then the next area where it comes in would be, for example, in areas like spare parts, right, where we are not producing in big volumes, but at the same time, we need to have stock availability of these products, and we do not know where the replacement parts need to go. So we are basically stocking and then sending by sea freight or most probably air freight all across the world in order to replenish all these maintenance and repair. So in cases like this, where the demand is uncertain, and the consumption is not high, then 3D printing also has a big value in terms of being able to do the on-demand manufacturing. So probably what we'll see is some kind of mixed manufacturing, where we have mass production for for conventional goods, right, like our iPhones, for example, or detergents, bottles, shampoo, and all that, where it's still based on mass manufacturing methods. But certainly in design prototyping, in spare parts, and in certain categories of customization for cars, for airplanes, for ships, where we are printing parts and replacements and customized structures, then 3D printing would certainly come into play.
Thanks, Big One. Yeah, I think we'll come to the topic on especially specific to ship supplies, and especially you mentioned about spare parts. Javier, I have this always this question sometimes when we talk about digital supply chains and digital trade. What do we exactly mean by that, right? If you compare it to the traditional physical trade, is this the same as, let's say, e-commerce?
So thank you very much, and let me just say that it's a great pleasure to be here. I think when we talk about digital trade, what we're really talking about is a range of things. And I think all of them recognize the fact that, and you mentioned it earlier, there is a paradigm shift in terms of globalization. I think it's useful to sort of have a definition, and the way that we define it at the OECD is that it's sort of trading goods and services that can be digitally ordered or digitally delivered. That tells us the academic way of defining, but what does this actually mean? Well, to a certain extent, digitalization means more traditional trade. So it means more trade in textiles, more trade in other types of garments, more trade in tourism, all of which is enabled by lower trading costs. So that's sort of the traditional side that is boosted. It also means more digitally ordered parcels, which cross international borders and which tends to be clocked through digital platforms. And what this does is that it connects smaller actors more readily to international trade, be they individuals buying and selling, but also smaller firms. At the same time, it means more digitally delivered trade, which of course includes new services, cloud computing and such, but also, smaller value services such as the ones that we consume on our mobile phones, as well as digitally delivered trades, which would include, 3D printing items, which I'll get back to, and whether they're goods or whether they're services, which matters. The other two elements that really matter in this evolving environment, the first one is smart products. These are products that combine the characteristics of goods and services and which are constantly connected. And so to trade those, you need to think about the goods, the rules for goods, the rules for services, and the rules for data, all in combination, which makes it all much more complex. And last but certainly not least, one of the biggest things in this digital trade environment, and which also relates to sort of the digital supply chains, is the cross-border movement of data. When you think of a modern day supply chain, the ones that Guan has been speaking about, all of those have a red thread, which is data that enables the transactions, whether it's in the production, in the R&D stage, or actually in the consumption stage, where data is sent back and forth to the consumer. So perhaps going back to your question, the trouble with the word e-commerce is that it's often used to refer to goods, or has been traditionally used to refer to goods. Actually, the first definition of e-commerce that came from the OECD was generally in the process of ordering, digital ordering, and didn't include digital delivery. When the WTO refers to e-commerce, it refers to ordering and to delivering and to much broader areas. And we have the feeling now that we use the term digital trade as a modern take of the WTO definition, which is about goods, services, data, but also about a whole range of new policies that include data flows, that include national security, that include privacy, intellectual property protection, cybersecurity, and other related issues. So I think it's all this idea that we are moving towards a world where trade and globalization is changing. And of course, 3D printing is a very big element of this, particularly looking towards the future.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what you just said is essentially what we're doing today is this whole trying to digitalize supply chains to make it more efficient, right? To minimize some of these disruptions, as opposed to digital trade. We're talking about transmission of data, right? Whether it's in designs that we can actually produce on demand locally. Hakon, do you have any thing to add to what Javier just mentioned?
Yes, thank you, Chaw. So Wilhelmsen, we are a company today that in partner with ThyssenKrupp is offering on-demand manufacturing of spare parts towards maritime and offshore. And the reason for doing this is that we see the pain points that is connected to the traditional supply chain. And I think the past 2-3 years during COVID and of course other things happening in Europe currently, especially with Ukraine and Russia, causes issues in the traditional supply chain model. That means that the lead time for spare parts is long, so it's difficult for the makers to support their customers in a good way. So hence, digital on-demand manufacturing has a quite strong value proposition in that regard, because it suddenly allows for parts being produced on demand close to the point of need. However, I don't believe that digital manufacturing will take fully over for traditional manufacturing. I think it goes hand in hand, and we're not there that from a commercial point of view that we can compete against mass production. It's a fantastic technology, or I would say technologies, because it's not only one 3D printing technology, it's multiple technologies, but that allows for solving these pain points and making sure that especially for our customers that are in the maritime and offshore area can stay operational. And of course, there are many other positive values and benefits from on-demand manufacturing, which I think that we'll come back to later on as well. But definitely something that is very promising, and we see a big demand and need for this in the market as well.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think the this question of whether 3D printing or these on-demand manufacturing will replace traditional is not likely. But let's come back in a while on a little bit on that as well. Javier, just wanted to also touch base. I actually remember reading a policy paper you did in 2020, and this was entitled "Is 3D Printing a Threat to Global Trade?" Can you share a little bit about with the audience what your findings were and the conclusions?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think the overall aim of the work was to try and get a better understanding for the issues at the intersection of 3D printing and trade, particularly to guide trade policymakers as to whether they should be concerned about these issues that we're talking about. And when we started the work, we quickly found out that there was a lot of speculation, and the speculation was essentially 3D printing is here to replace physical trade. And many people thought of the technology in the same way that we tend to think about Star Trek replicators. That is, that you could just magic items out of light. And so, when you think about the technology in that way, you quickly get carried away, and there's a world of possibilities, reconfiguration of global value chains, and so what. What we tried to do was try to ground the analysis a bit and try to say, okay, what does the technology actually do today? And what does that tell us about the potential for the technology to replace international trade? And I think we came up with the similar conclusions that have already been mentioned by Hakon and Guan as well. Is essentially that 3D printing is a really cool technology. It's very versatile, many potential applications across a range of specific tasks, very well suited to the production of low volumes of geometrically complex and materially simple objects. However, cost and quality advantages of traditional manufacturing are likely to remain for many, many products. There's still a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to 3D print a mobile phone tomorrow. So it's going to take a long time for this. So it's going to be a gradual change. And in particular, what we do at the OECD is provide some of the evidence base. I'm an economist by training, so we tried to frame this in an analytical paper where we wanted to look at the impact of importing 3D printing machines on the ability to export 3D printable items. And what we found is that there was a positive relationship between these two variables. That is, that countries that tended to import 3D printing machines would then go on to export more 3D printable items. And this told us that rather than a substitute, that where you would have expected that importing 3D printers would mean less trade, it actually meant more trade, more exports. And also we found that the relationship with imports was as expected. You actually imported more 3D printable items when you imported 3D printed machines. So this overall suggests that the concerns perhaps raised on the substitution of physical trade are a bit far-fetched at the moment, and these has implications for some of the discussions that are being had at the WTO, including in the context of the moratorium on applying customs duties on electronic transmissions, which is this discussion that's this practice that is we don't apply customs duties or tariffs on electronic transmissions. It's been extended for many years, but these it's been extended at the ministerial every 2 years. So this is a very heated debate at the moment, and 3D printing and the question of 3D printing is very important in this debate.
Guan, do you have anything to add? I know you did a similar study.
Sure. So in that study, what we are looking at was kind of the effect on finished goods trade, and potentially what impact it might have on shipping. So I think, like what both what Javier said, right, and what Hakon said. So I think, when we look, basically the starting point, right, is that 3D printing is growing really fast. It's cool. It's growing at 20% a year. But as of today, it forms like 0.1% of total manufacturing, right now. So in terms of the replacement effect for finished goods, it's not going to happen in the short or medium term. If we look at, the sort of potential growth projections over the years, and it depends, right, on the simulation of what those growth rates might be, the kind of visible impact that we might see on this substitution effect may actually take place in, the late 2030s or 2040s, right, where we can see some significant impact on, reduction in finished goods, cross-border trade, just simply because, it can be done locally. And even then, we're talking about a 5% type, 5-6% type, change, possibly a 10%, right? But it really depends on what is the growth trajectory of the technology, and whether the technology can grow at this rate, whether it is cost effective, whether it's technologically capable of doing the range of products, right, to take over more and more of the finished goods. So a lot of this is still out in the the jury is still out on this, right? And I think the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see, to what extent, it can actually take over some of these traditional manufacturing functions. I think the other thing that, of course, there are also other opportunities, right? And Javier kind of mentioned that as well, with the 3D printers, and also the composite materials and the raw materials, right, which are needed for 3D printing. So that actually could be part of that trade as well, and to a large extent that benefits advanced countries or advanced economies that sort of focus on smart manufacturing, and sort of digital manufacturing capabilities. So that could be a benefit as well. Even areas that have to do with digital trade, like data centers, sending of blueprints, storage of blueprints, and so data centers, and sort of legal and financial services that need to be in place in order to create all these sort of digital flows. That is still being worked out, right? But certainly those are potential opportunities as well in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's no doubt the technology even with this progress, there's still, I would say, in some way, a long way to go to capture, right, a big part of what the current traditional manufacturing is enabling. Let me just switch tack a little bit. Back to you, Hakon. I just want, given the fact that you have been working in this space for, especially in the focus on ship supplies, could you just share with the audience some of the maybe 1 or 2 case studies that you have done, and What do you see the value for your customers in using these on-demand manufacturing based on 3D printing technology?
Yeah, sure. So I think just to give you some high levels, we have delivered 800 3D printer parts produced on demand, close to the point of need. The parts have solved key spare parts issues. We have shortened it LPO to be easy to remember, and that is long lead time. The maritime assets, the vessels are moving, and often they're in areas where obtaining spare parts is not easy. A part might not be in inventory or needs to be produced on demand through traditional means. So you can talk months lead time. The P in the LPO is poor part performance. There are parts having corrosion issues, poor design, etc. And of course, 3D printing and with engineering capabilities, you can do material conversions, improve designs. We've done many of these type of parts. And the last element is the O in the LPO, which is obsolete parts, and that are parts that are no longer being supported in the market. OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, the pump maker, engine maker, etc., is not available, not existing anymore. And we've done many of those types of parts. What we see in the role that we're taking in the on-demand manufacturing ecosystem is that we're taking an orchestrator role in this ecosystem, and that ecosystem consists of end users. Those are the shipping owners, managers, oil and gas platform owner, operators, etc. And the ones that use the service, procures the parts. Then you have the OEMs, which are the original equipment manufacturers, engine pump makers. They are the ones owning the designs, have the IP of the parts. And then you have the manufacturing partners. Those are the company actually manufacturing the parts. And then, of course, you have class, which puts the approval stamps, certifies the parts, make sure that the quality and everything that needs to be in place is in place. And what we've seen over the past 2 years, transitioning from pilot to scale up and commercialization, etc., is that the end user side has been fairly easy to onboard end users. It's a huge need in the market because they feel these pains. They're losing money, causing operational issues, especially these days. I have customers calling me saying that this and this OEM cannot deliver this part in months. I can have potential downtime on my vessel or offshore platform. We've seen a big shift during COVID on the OEM side. We see now more and more OEMs showing interest. They see that they need to have alternative means. They need some resilience in their supply chain. Of course, these technologies is a great way of doing that. From manufacturing partnership point of view, there are service manufacturing companies all around the world. They're typically focused on one or two industries and one or two technologies. And of course, for them, starting to serve maritime has been a very interesting value proposition for them. So we're constantly focused on building this ecosystem, building our digital warehouse with OEM files, etc. And I can also share a few examples that we've done as part of this. For instance, a seawater pump impeller that we delivered to one of our customers, Bernhard Schulte Ship Management, and that had approximately 4 months lead time in the market, causing operational issues to the vessel. This part probably has a cost in the market of $1,800 to $200 USD before freight and customs. Whereas we could do that part in 5 days through rapid casting, which is a hybrid manufacturing approach. You 3D print the mold and you rapidly cast the part, one of many technologies that we use. We can do that in 5 days, and the cost was probably around $2,500 to $3,000. I don't remember exactly. This is in a way a bit more expensive, but still you solve that pain point for the customer where the alternative cost of waiting would have been much higher. So we see that if you compare production cost to production cost, 3D printing is in many cases more expensive. But if you take it from a total cost of ownership, which is important, then you see that it's from a commercial feasibility point of view very, very interesting. Other examples is, for instance, a Kawasaki part which you're working with is a side thruster propeller blade, 85 kilo part, very large part, of course, long lead time item, also low volume production. And especially for low volume production, we suddenly see that we can compete on production price. being very close, in addition to then, of course, then providing short lead times, which is interesting. So that's a part now being installed in June during dry dock for one of our customers. We have many other examples as well. But I think the LPO is probably something I want to emphasize, that these are the pain points, a pain point driven service in a way. And we see both interest from all the different stakeholder groups, because if you don't have interest from the OEMs, only the end users, it will be difficult to build a large service which brings value to the market.
What about the IP? From an IP perspective, is there any barriers that you have from your engagements you have with your clients, with the OEMs?
So IP is super important, and we're not trying to be the new gray market for spare parts. So that's why the partnerships and collaborations that we're having with OEMs are very important, because we work with the design owners. They're their IP, but we're enabling them to offer these parts on demand when that is needed. So we're currently working with around 15 OEMs on these areas, and we see that there's back to your first question, do you see any type of parts? It's more from a pain point perspective. It's not necessarily from a segment perspective. It's everything from pumps to engines to cranes to everything, unless it's electrical components, of course. It's more on the polymer metal side. So yeah, it's IP is important. Hence that's why we work with the IP owner instead of copying their designs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's. I think it's very. I mean, it's great that you guys are doing, kind of pioneering this space right now, trying to, build the use cases, and I think going with that is also coming up with a business model, right? To that makes it very sustainable in the long run. On the topic of the digital trade again, I think Javier, you shared some of the study outcomes that you made. In your view, and this is just a very hypothetical question, do you envision a day where digital trade will grow to replace physical trade significantly? And what are some of the barriers in your view to digital trade, notwithstanding whether using 3D printing technology?
I mean, I think that the answer to that question is quite difficult. I think that Guan put it best, saying, it all depends on the adoption of these technologies, whether it's 3D printing, but also AI technologies and IoT. I mean, all indications are that, it's growing very much, but we tend to exaggerate some of these technologies. When we had books that could be turned into ebooks, we thought that all books would be ebooks, and actually we tend to see that there's sort of a mechanisms by which we have both sort of coexist. I think there are two factors that are important to consider here. The first factor to consider in terms of 3D printing is what are the capabilities of the technology and how fast those evolve. Currently it's limited by scale, but also limited to what can be 3D printed. But there is a lot of news about new additive manufacturing processes and nano printing and things like that, which provide new exciting avenues. But very importantly, and Chaw, you mentioned this earlier, is the business model. And sort of for me, or for the way that we think about it, is in two ways. We can think about 3D printing as a technology that enables the delivery of goods, or we can think of 3D printing as a technology that is productivity enhancing. And I think Hakon's examples play towards the fact that a lot of the advances that we're seeing at the moment is the productivity enhancing advancements. And what it's essentially saying is that, a company can now produce items that were being produced at sort of cheaper or similar cost, but they can deliver them faster. So these are essentially all productivity markups. And sort of when we see this as a productivity markup, we see a framing where there's still value in, concentrating production and shipping. And so in that sense, I think that that's important. However, there is a scare that, when we do these technologies, perhaps down the line, many, many years down the line, when they become more of a distribution technology, then there's going to be important changes. But even then, I wouldn't exaggerate the replacement. I would say it would be different type of trade. We'll have to have a lot more trade in raw materials, the ink that is being used for the 3D printers, but also, as Hakon was mentioning, we're not. There's still IP. We're basically changing physical trade for digital trade. It's still goods trade for services trade. So I wouldn't be too scared about that. What I would say, though, is that this causes some trouble for trade policy. Now, where we are in the world with trade policy is that we've done loads of progress in terms of liberalizing goods trade, and we have goods schedules, and they're very low tariffs and things like that. On services trade, things are much more complicated, and the issue that 3D printing raises as a delivery technology is whether it's a good or whether it's a service. When the IP crosses the border, it's a design service, but when it reaches the user, it's a good. So which types of rules apply? The ones for the GATS, which are for goods, or the one for the GATS? And the other challenge is, where is the IP coming from? Because data can move across borders very freely. So, if you have a free trade agreement with someone, then you can send the data from that particular area and then benefit from the preferences. So it raises a whole bunch of trade policy concerns that are being discussed at the moment at the WTO and in trade agreements. I'll leave it at that.
And
yeah,
just to chime in that,
Go ahead.
Probably a question from me to Javier, because what's interesting here is that in a way you're transferring digital file, but the material that is going to produce the part has already been imported to the country that will manufacture the part, but the file is just connecting the material to make the final product. So in a way, it's you could say it's both digital and physical trade at once.
Yes, and I think that we've found similar challenges in the classification of assembly services. So it's kind of funny, because I think that now in the system of national accounts, when we think about assembly, such as the ones that are being done for the iPhone, that's essentially a service that is being outsourced, when clearly it relates to a manufacturing activity. So I think that's what you're saying is a similar issue. I think, though, that we shouldn't be too concerned, because we know we can deal with digitally delivered services, and there are ways of taxing them, and there are ways with enabling their flows and enabling regulatory harmonization within those. It's just that it's a bit more difficult than it was with goods. And so the problem is that if we move very suddenly from goods to services, we're going to find a world that is less open than it was for the case for goods. So we need to adapt, and we need some time, because trade policy makers take their time in liberalizing.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting insight. And I'm just checking the pigeonhole. It appears there's no questions from the audience, and I'm also conscious of time, because we need to wrap up probably in 5 minutes. I just have one question that on this topic of digital trade. You mentioned about some of these trade policy instruments that still need to be amended. What is the current status of that discussion? I mean, is it being folded into some of these free trade agreements that countries have between each other, or because today, as I know it, I mean, I'm not a trade policy expert, but it doesn't seem like there's any tax whatsoever on digital data, right? Because I remember when we did the nasopharyngeal swab, we gave these designs freely to the world. People could use it, right? So, do you see that something that we could continue as it is today, or there'll be changes to that?
I mean, I think that cause for optimism. 3 key areas where developments are being made. The first one is multilaterally. We've got the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, and that discusses a whole bunch of issues which are going to be really important. It discusses, amongst others, some issues related to market access, or at least they're trying to for services, but also the use of digital trade facilitation tools. as well as the reduction of barriers such as forced localization, cross-border data flow restrictions, consumer protection. So they've got a very big agenda of things that are being discussed that will be multilateral, and that's sort of the biggest hope. At the same time, and in parallel, we have a bunch of regional trade agreements which are increasingly incorporating provisions on e-commerce and on digital trade. And also in parallel, we have these digital economy partnership agreements, which Singapore in particular is championing, which contain even further elements of discussion on issues such as artificial intelligence and smart manufacturing and things like that. So I think on all of that, there's a reason to be optimistic, but there's still legacy discussions. And I mentioned the moratorium discussion where, for instance, if at the WTO at MC12, that's supposed to be happening in June, countries decide not to extend the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, then there's a likelihood that countries will be allowed to put tariffs on the electronic transmissions themselves. And that, I think, is more dangerous. It's more difficult to understand how you might go about putting a tariff on an electronic transmission, because on a good, it comes in through customs and you put a tariff on it and you collect, and that's relatively easy. On an electronic transmission, it's difficult to know how you would do it. So I think we also have to be a bit cautious about some of the ongoing discussions and hope that, at least for the moratorium, that is continued, extended, or even made permanent.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that, if that happens, this will in some way put a brakes on something that's still kind of early. But for sure, in context of what we are seeing today, the value of having this digital trade, to, I would say, enable some of these localized production ecosystems. I think to add some resilience to our, current global supply chain. I think this is something that we've seen ourselves firsthand how powerful it can be, and I think, it's not new in some ways. I think Singapore is trying to, do something similar. Having some of these enterprise developments in 3D printing to enable some of these parts on demand. But this will take a long time. Sorry, Guan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe I can also add on a little bit to that. I think if we think about e-commerce, right, as a sort of to see what could possibly happen in the future, is the same thing, right? What happened with e-commerce on retail took place over a 15, 20-year period. So, and e-commerce, although we think of it as digital in a sense, it gave rise to a lot of physical movements, with the logistics and last mile, right? And also the warehouse facilities. So the same thing could happen, right? When we think about the decentralization of manufacturing, and again, it's a mixed manufacturing, right? What we all said, it's not totally replacement. So, there'll be need for storage of raw materials, there'll be need for movement of printers, and all this decentralization of printers, so it's a mix of the digital and the physical, right? There's a blueprint moving, but just because a blueprint is downloaded, someone still has to make it. So there still has to be a service bureau to print, right? To manufacture this part or this component or this, finished good. And, and it could be a service bureau, it could be, decentralized manufacturing, it could be home printing. So new sort of physical goods and services, right, will also arise as a result of that. So it's going to be a very complex mix, right, of both the digital and physical, and it's not just sort of one aspect.
Absolutely. I think it's like what we term it as micro factories, right? I mean, we're starting to see some of these micro factory concept even springing up, in Singapore as well. Of course, technologically, there are still some barriers. It's not ubiquitous in the sense that you could print anything you want, but for certain things, we believe the technology will scale to the point where is able to do more functional products in the long time to come. Okay, I just want to, I think we're pretty much coming towards the end. I just want to maybe, ask you guys to give a couple sentence roundup from each one of you, from your perspective. How do you see the future of these, production that's, combined with this, hybrid model of localized and the global supply chains, from your perspective, from your different vantage points? Who wants to? Anyone can start.
I can kick off. No, I think as I mentioned earlier, I think traditional manufacturing and digital on-demand manufacturing will continue to go hand by hand. I think the technology is always developing. It's becoming more and more affordable. It's cheaper to print a part today than it was 5 years ago. So we will probably see a larger percentage of parts being in the commercial feasibility scope for on-demand manufacturing. I think what we will continue to see is that you will continue to see the development of ecosystems to make this happen. I think one single company isn't able to do this alone. You need an ecosystem of different stakeholders to make this happen, regardless if it is maritime or offshore or railway or medical. There are many elements here that is important to consider. You have the end users, you have the IP owners, you have the authorities, etc. I think we will see this, at least from our point of view, who is investing into this and believing into this strongly. We will see more and more of this going forward, which I find very exciting on many levels, of course.
Thank you. Javier or Guan?
Happy to come in. I mean, I think I like to be an optimist and think that the future is bright, and I sort of tag along with Hakon's view of these things are going to develop hand in hand. I think we're not going to be talking about digital trade. We're just going to be talking about trade in the 21st century in the future. Like, this is going to become the new normal. Now we put digital trade on it because we want to focus on specific elements, but it's going to be mainstream relatively quickly. I mean, I think also one of the changes that we need to be aware of is how we consume is changing quite a lot. And I think that rather than on the production side, where we have very good logistics and value chains, we're going to see quite a bit of changes of adaptation needed for changes in consumption, people consuming more digital products, but also some other possible changes in terms of their physical consumption. And I think what is really important in all of this is that we continue to provide an agile trade policy that can adapt and foresee, not too rigid, that, it's the trade policy for 10 years ago, and not so flexible that there's no binding rules, but, happily somewhere in the middle so that we can enable, the companies to do what they need to do and the consumers to be able to consume and governments to meet the desired policy objectives they want with their trade policies.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. I think this perspective on product customization, especially, I think beyond, of course, there's all this increased emphasis on improving, product design, but doing it in a way that doesn't consume a lot of materials. Of course, this topic about lowering carbon emissions with freight reduction, I think these are what's driving, the need for change as well. Want any last words from you?
Sure. Okay, thanks. So I would say that probably this is an opportunity now for exploring the commercialization, or the trial of different, items and sort of development of different items. And simply because, there's so much disruption going on. So it actually has added to the cost, right? And Hakon talked about it, added to the cost of, the delays and therefore the on-demand manufacturing, in a way becomes more important now. So that's probably one perspective. I think the second one is that for the medium and long term, while there's a need for companies to explore, right? And that could be working with customers, or could be working with even R&D, institutes, right? Funding agencies like NAMIC, for example, to look at how, these initiatives can be developed, because, we don't know how the technology will shape on the next 10 years. But if it's like e-commerce, then it could be very transformative, but we cannot wait 10 years to find out. Right, so this is probably a good time to sort of test waters and try it out, right, and see how it leads us to being able to use it in some mixed manufacturing form.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that I think that everybody needs to come in together. It's a global ecosystem that needs to come together and work together, both on the technology side as well as on the trade policy side. To make sure that it makes sense, right? And I like the term not so much digital trade, but trade in the 21st century. I think that's a very good term that's coined by Javier. With that, I want to end this session today, and I want to first very much thank all of you here today for spending a very valuable time to share your perspectives on this very interesting topic. As from my perspective, as the world tries to return to pre-COVID levels in industrial urban activities, I think there's no doubt that there's a new norm coming. We need to be adaptable and flexible, very open-minded to new technologies that will play a major role in new paradigms in the future of distributed manufacturing and trade. With that, we've come to the end of the session. Thank you very much again, Hakon, Puay, Guan, and Javier. We're very delighted to have you here today. And I wish all of you in the audience a very good afternoon and evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Yes, and to quote William Gibson, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And I think it's conferences and events like this that can help us to distribute the future more evenly and to do this more quickly. I won't even attempt to summarize what people said, but I think we can sort of see the advantage of virtual events actually like this, because it allows us to bring in a very efficient and effective manner together people from around the world and have a very deep substantive discussion. So thanks very much for everybody who made this possible, the organizers and the audience, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much, guys. Bye-bye.